Well, we are in the first century layer. We have moved from Abraham and now we're up to the time of Jesus. We're dealing with his ministry, and tonight we're going to cover the city of Capernaum or Capernaum, depending on your translation or how you write it. And I'll show you both because they both work the same. This was the base of Jesus' ministry. This was his hub the entire time that he was serving in Galilee. So it was most of his ministry. And most of the gospel stories that we have took place in Capernaum, whether we realize it or not. Probably more than any other site, second to Jerusalem. Everything else happened in Capernaum, pretty much. Capernaum is featured in the New Testament, but it was started around 2 BC, around the time of Jesus being born, and so it's never mentioned in the Old Testament. But it's a city that's located on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee. It was a fishing village predominantly, but it was also one of trade during the time of the Herods. Okay? It's significant in the scriptures just because this was Jesus' home after being kicked out of Nazareth in his first sermon. Now, by the way, if you have been with us on our Wednesday nights, we just went through that in Luke chapter 4. And they tried to throw him off the cliff, you remember, on the hillside. Well, immediately afterwards, he decides that they reject him, so then he goes to Capernaum, and this is where he makes his home. Capernaum is also the home of Peter and Andrew and James. This was their home base. So just as the little sign says, welcome to Capernaum. And notice how they spell it. Capernaum. Then look at the next sign that you see. Welcome to Capernaum. Capernaum. I don't know why they spell it differently, but it's pronounced both, and that's the alternative spelling. Here's where it's at on the map. This is the Sea of Galilee, of course. Down here is Nazareth, where Jesus was raised, where they rejected him. If you go that way, that would be Megiddo, in the valley of Jezreel, and the Armageddon is down this way. And so then he came up here. Here's Canaan of Galilee. This is where Jesus did his first miracle, turning the water into wine. Okay, here's Bethsaida, where he did many miracles. You get the idea. This is, unfortunately, a very small map for size, but I'm going to just show you some of the bullet points of the stories that you might recognize from the scriptures. Okay, up here at the top of the Sea of Galilee to the west is Capernaum, and that's where we're going to be talking about predominantly tonight. But then going clockwise, I just put a bunch of little arrows of places that we will mention or come to. And right above this is Chorazin, where Jesus cursed them because they heard so many of his teachings and his preachings, and they saw so many miracles, and yet they didn't obey. And he said it's going to be better for the Tyre and Sidon, which were Gentile cities, than you on Judgment Day. And that is Chorazin, and I'll show you a picture of that as we're going through. To the right here, this is Bethsaida, and it was Chorazin, Bethsaida, and Capernaum that Jesus did curse, and we'll talk about that. To the right here, this is Ramat. This is actually where we stayed. It's a very nice resort that looks across the Sea of Galilee. And I'll show you pictures of that as well. Here is Gesera, or how we would say it, Gadara. And if you remember the man that had the legion of demons in him that Jesus cast out, put him in the pigs, and the pigs went over the cliff, that's where it took place, was right here. Now this arrow is a little bit deceiving because it's pointing down this way, but actually all the way along this east side, this is what they call the Golan Heights. And usually when you hear about rockets being fired, they're being fired from the Golan Heights, which I did find interesting because this is the Golan Heights and we stayed there. It was close, and I'll describe that a little bit when we get there. Over here is called the Horns of Hittim, and there's two large mountains that stick up out of the ground. And as the wind would come by across the lake, it would split between those mountains. And as it did, it would stir up the wind really bad. And on several occasions, the disciples are out in a boat, right? And the wind kicks up all of a sudden, and they're risking their lives. It's because of these horns of Hittim. When the wind comes through and cuts across the Sea of Galilee, a storm can happen immediately. It can just burst up in just a few minutes and be very dangerous. So that's here. Then here is Magdala. If you remember the lady named Mary of Magdalene, that's where she was from. This is Tiberias. It was a city that was set up after the time of Jesus' ministry, and so we don't really read about it in the scriptures, but there's quite a bit that has actually taken place there since. And then up here, next to Capernaum, is the Mount of Beatitudes. And Matthew chapter 5 through chapter 7 is where Jesus preached his Sermon on the Mount. That's always rather convicting. So anyways, I just wanted to show you around the Sea of Galilee pretty much. We didn't really cover anything in the south, but we're not going to do that tonight anyway.
What's the length of that sea?
13 miles long. It's actually very small, and I was actually just about to talk about that. It's the population of the city of Capernaum was only 1,500 people during the time of Jesus. But here's what's interesting. It's on this sea, and it's 673 feet below sea level. It's massively below. And I really want you to remember how low in sea level it is, because when we get to Caesarea Philippi in a few weeks, like 2 or 3 weeks, it's going to be very, very important and literally world-changing that Capernaum is so below sea level. And I'll explain that when we get there. For some reason, I apologize, I missed that slide. Oops. Oh, there it is. Okay, well, yeah, I'll come back to that comment, Gary, in just a minute, because I did put all of that information in there. Okay, this site was occupied from the 1st century BC to the 10th century, and then it was abandoned and lost until 1894, when Franciscan monks bought the property and the Eastern Orthodox Church, and they hold around 2/3 of the property that's remained unexcavated. And you can kind of see the rocks here, but that's pretty much it. You can see the outline of homes all through here, and notice how dark and black these stones are. That's going to be very important as well. Right here, this is the low rent district of town. They could figure this out because of several things. This was the working man's home. They were all smaller. The homes were closer together. And they weren't very far. Right in here, you can see the water in behind. They were close to where they worked. So it was a low rent district. And we will see, if you turn to the right just a little bit, you will see a well-known person's house there, close to the shoreline. Here's another picture of the town and the walls of the cities. Capernaum's name originates from 2 Hebrew words, Kafar and Nahum. And Kafar is village, and Nahum is a man's name. But they lost that man to time. In the Greek, though, it means a village of comfort. Now, what's interesting is, you can't see it here, but we've talked about it on many occasions, the Via Maris that was a trade route. The Via Maris stretched, it connected Egypt to Asia, Turkey, and Europe. It went north and south, went right across the middle of Israel. And if you were going to go from Egypt and do trade routes, that's where you went. Well, it went through Capernaum. And because Capernaum was on the trade route, and because it was also a port on the Sea of Galilee, it was huge and important. Everybody stopped there. It was massive for trade. If you wanted to be a merchant in this time, this is where you wanted to be stationed, because everybody visited this place. It was founded in the 6th century BC during the Greek period, and fishing served as its main occupation. Capernaum had a garrison of soldiers from the Romans that served there. It was their administrative center, and you know one of them very well if you've been following on our Wednesday nights. Due to this location's busy trade route, it was also a customs station. So when you came by, you got to pay taxes. And we also know the man that had the taxes in this city. In fact, you've probably read his book. It's called The Gospel of Matthew. This is where Matthew was a tax collector. Okay? And because this is a major trade route, because it's a major port, Matthew was a very rich man. This was a good place to be a tax collector. All right? Its life extended from the 10th century AD, from the 2nd century all the way to the 10th century. And it prospered until the Muslims came in the 8th and 7th centuries. And after that, it kind of fell apart. We won't go there. Why, right? Here's some more. You can see, I wanted you to notice the difference. You see these black stones, and then you see these white limestones. They're two totally different things. All of the white that you will see is all imported by the Romans and the Greeks. All of this black you see is all close to home. The other thing that I want you to see is I want you to see this UFO. I'll explain it in a minute. This black stone is called basalt. Okay? And this basalt is all from the 1st century period. So everything that you saw that was black, that was in a part of a building, that was all from the time of Jesus. This stone is found all over the north regions of the Sea of Galilee. And again, I want you to remember it, because when we come to Caesarea Philippi, those black volcanic stones changed the world. They literally changed the world, and I'll explain when we get there. All right, here's one more picture. Here shows you some of the beautiful carving. Can you imagine having these as your crown molding? They've got pomegranates here. This one's grapes hanging out of jars. There's a Star of David. Take note if you know what I'm talking about. Pomegranates and figs and all of these beautiful carvings. It goes to show how lavish and expensive this place was. It was a major trade route. And so you can see those. Here's some more. I mean, can you imagine carving all of that and then setting it up? It's just incredible. So that was on the synagogue, by the way. Here's one that's interesting. This has an inscription on it. You can barely see it right up there with my picture. But it's in Aramaic from the 5th century, and it reads, Alphaeus, the son of Zebedee, son of John. Place this column here. May it be ascribed to him as blessing. Now, isn't that interesting? Those names sound very familiar, don't they? Now, it may have been another man named John who was the son of Alphaeus. Not sure. But we do know that family name very well. This is another one. This post is actually a mile marker. And it's a mile marker off the Via Maris. And it has a Roman inscription that talks about Emperor Hadrian, and it was honored to him, but it was along that mark. Here is that Via Maris. We talked about Caesarea by the Sea, Caesarea Maritime, last week, it was last week, 2 weeks ago. And that was on the same Via Maris. Then you come across here, this is where Megiddo is. Here's the Valley of Armageddon. There's Nazareth that it went through. There's Tiberias. There's Capernaum. And then other places that we've talked about in our rabbit trails, Hatzor and Tel Dan to the north, all of them were on the trade routes. And the reason we talk about them is there's so much history around them because they were so filthy wealthy because of that trade route. But here's what's cool. Because Capernaum was here on the sea and the Via Maris went straight across it, you had a port that stretched all the way over here. You had roads that tried to connect with this and literally went everywhere in the known world. God used that Via Maris and the city of Capernaum to spread the good news about him everywhere. There was all kinds of visitors. There was all kinds of fishermen. There was all kinds of shop dealers that all traveled through this city. And this is where Jesus made his hometown. Everybody heard about Jesus. And it was all spread because of this city, Capernaum, and the Via Maris. Jesus did more miracles here than any other city that's recorded, like I said, just shy of Jerusalem. This was it. He preached more in this town and this area than any other place in his ministry, including Jerusalem, because he spent much more time here. So let's see, what else is in this town? Well, I want you to see the difference here. You see how beautiful white this is? Remember I said all the white stones are imported lime? Notice the base. If you see the base way back here, whoever built the synagogue on top of here did a great job. They lined the foundation, this black foundation, up perfectly. But then look down here. You can't tell it, but that's almost a foot where they got off. And they were like, why in the world did they mess that building up so bad? Well, it turns out this is built around the 4th century. But down here, that basalt that's native to the land, that's the 1st century synagogue. And here's what's important to that. We know someone that preached in that synagogue right there. And I got to stand over top of where he did. And I'll tell you what, that is a humbling feeling to stand where Jesus stood and preached the gospel. It was down here in this level where we know it's recorded for us that Jesus preached his sermons. After leaving Nazareth, he preached at these. Here's in this 4th century synagogue. Here's some inscriptions, and we've actually got a really funny story about that. Some of you know the name Bob Cornuke, well-known archaeologist. He was one of our leaders on the trip, and he comes up and he says, everybody come here, everybody come here. He said, he pointed up to these posts and he said, does anybody read Greek? And several of us pastors hung our head in shame and said, no, not in a long time. And he says, that's all right. He says, I'll translate for you. He says, let me tell you what it says. He says, let me tell you, and we're all writing notes, about a story of a man named Jed, a poor mountaineer that barely kept his family fed. And by that point, we all realized we'd been had. His point, which he went on to tell us, was don't ever take anything that we say for granted, but study it for yourself to know if it's the truth or not. He said, because you can come out here and people can tell you all kinds of stories, and none of them may be true, but they're all trying to fill their pockets. And it was a good lesson, not just for us pastors because we couldn't read Greek, but it was also a reminder that we need to be careful what information we take in and what sources we get our information from. So don't just believe what you hear from me, do your own research. This is that 2nd century synagogue. I took that picture because my dad's standing there, so he couldn't have. I took that one. This is where Jesus preached, not underneath this one, I should say, is where Jesus preached the message, I am the bread of life. If anyone eats this flesh and drinks this blood. This is where Jairus was the synagogue leader. And you remember Jesus healed his daughter. This synagogue that's underneath in the black basalt is the one where the centurion that we read about just Wednesday purchased and built for the Jews that were here. This is the same synagogue. And then Jesus healed the centurion's servant. The Roman centurions, the leader's daughter or son, I can't remember which, they came to Jesus while he was in Canaan. And Jesus healed the boy far off. That also took place here. That's where the boy was from. All right. All of these took place in that beautiful synagogue or just below it. This one, the original one was destroyed, and they built this one on top some 200 years later. But you can, as I said, you can still see the basalt original right below it. Across the street from that synagogue, you see this flying saucer. Doesn't this look like something the E.T. would try and phone home from? Yeah. I have no idea why they built it. It's stupid. It's ugly. It's obtrusive. What's not really important is that the Franciscan monks built a chapel there, but actually what is underneath that chapel is very important to us. Archaeologists uncovered a Christian home there in Capernaum, less than 100 feet from the Jewish synagogue. It's believed to be Peter's home. This was Peter's house. And it was expanded. They found in archaeology, before they put that obtrusive thing up above it, it was expanded 3 different times. And after Jesus' death became a church. And they used it as a church. But this is literally where Jesus would have slept. They have well, I'll show you that in a second. This is what Peter's house would have looked like from the archaeology. You remember the story of the man that was so paralytic and the friends brought him in and they tore off the tile on the house? They believe that it was Peter's house that took place in. This is where Jesus would have healed Peter's mother-in-law in Matthew chapter 8. After that, again, it was built 3 different times. And you can see this is the first layer. That's Peter's house. After that was this built. And then after that was this built. And they made a church out of it. After Jesus' death, anyways. It's got immense number of etchings and scratchings where people would graffiti saying that they had been there. And that they had made their personal trek to Peter's home where Jesus slept. Now there's a massive UFO that stands on top of it that the first Franciscan monks decide to put there. If they continue on the path that they're currently on, conspiracy theories all add into that, and hey, maybe, I won't go there, but you can take that for what it's worth. On the side, these are some of the stonework, and by the way, it's just beautiful mosaics. The sidewalk next to what was next to Peter's house. This is inside the church, the Franciscan UFO, that they have glass, and you can go in there and you can look and see the inside. And as we've talked about before, when we have church, there's a preacher up front and everybody's sitting in the pews. But when they had church, they had a circle, and one person would stand up and talk, and then somebody else would stand up and talk, and it was conversation. It wasn't just one person talking. And that's the reason they had such a problem when speaking in tongues, because everybody was speaking in tongues at the same size. And again, that's only 8 feet wide. You never heard anything going on. So that's looking into it. Of course, the Catholics, being proud of their first false pope or prophet, whatever you want to call it, erected a massive statue to Peter. And he's got his staff for leadership. He's got the fish showing that he's a fisher of men now, and the keys to the kingdom that Jesus discussed with him at Caesarea Philippi. Forgive the picture. This is my best attempt at a panoramic shot. I'm terrible at them. The land does not make a 90-degree angle. It's supposed to be straight across, but I'm not a photographer either. On the right here, you see the dock. And this is why I wanted to show you this picture. Again, notice all the basalt. That's a lot of volcanic rock. And they're 673 feet below sea level. You don't see a volcano there anywhere. All right. Here's the dock. And this is the same dock. Obviously they've added to it and fixed it up. But it's the same dock that was used in the 1st century. This is where Jesus would have come out and called to Peter and John and James and said, "Follow me and I will make you fishers of men." You can actually go quite a ways, several hundred feet out into the water here, before it even gets up to waist deep. And so you can picture in your mind Peter cleaning his nets about knee-deep water as Jesus comes up and says, "Peter, let me use your boat." So Peter takes his boat out a little bit from shore, and Jesus sits down and begins to teach the people. And then he would come to Peter and say, hey, Peter, why don't you go back fishing again? No, Lord, I've been out all night, but if you tell me to, I will. And then he got so many fish he could barely haul them in. You remember that story. We covered that in the book of Luke. But just picture everything that took place for the disciples. Jesus calling them, including Matthew, all here at this location. This is where it took place. Now, what this is actually doing, this is a picture, and it's actually looking towards Ramat, which is where we stayed over in this hill. That's also the Golan Heights. But we say a sea. But for us, we would call it a lake. Because even on a cloudy day like this was, even my phone, you could see to the other side, all the way across the lake. It's really actually pretty small. And again, this is the dock where Jesus would have said, follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. It's somewhere on this hillside where Jesus went up to pray all night while his disciples were struggling in the storm, and where Peter would have come out walking on the water to Jesus. That's where it took place. And we can debate in archaeology dates and times and places, if this building was this or this was that. Sea of Galilee hasn't changed. We know this is where it's at. And I'll be honest, walking on that water would have been a struggle. To describe Capernaum or Capernaum appropriately, we also need to talk about the Sea of Galilee. Although it's named the sea, it is fresh water. We think sea, we think saltwater. This is fresh water. And it's also not as big as you think. It's only 64 square miles. Okay? This is not large at all. Now, it does get to 200 feet deep, but in relative terms, to give you an idea, Lake Erie, which is one of the smallest Great Lakes, was like 3 million square miles or something goofy like that. This is 64 square miles. In the United States, we have larger man-made lakes than the Sea of Galilee. It's really small.
Dan, in comparison, he knows. I grew up in Okeechobee, Ohio, Okeechobee, Florida. It's a fishing lake down here. Are you from there too?
Yeah, well, I'm from West Palm, yeah.
Okay, so Okeechobee, this is like 8 miles by about 13, something like
Yeah.
that, what you're saying. And the depth of it it's pretty deep. Okeechobee is 30 miles wide, or length, 30 by 35. It's a freshwater lake. It's actually the second largest freshwater lake in the nation. Lake Erie, that's enclosed, fully enclosed.
Sure, yeah.
But I'm finding that what's fascinating is the elevation of Lake Okeechobee is about 12 feet above sea level. And yet the average depth of that lake, I'm making comparisons in my mind here. The average, it's so shallow, the average depth is 9 feet. So when the wind comes across, like you mentioned here, but I'm thinking this is called a sea. Lake Okeechobee, they're both fresh water, and Lake Okeechobee is, in comparison, probably 4 times the size. And I'm just having to do that comparison in my mind. Depth, but this is much deeper from what you're saying. Okeechobee on average is 8 feet to 9 feet deep. Now you find 12-foot spots. The government cut where the Army Corps of Engineers dug out, that goes 30 to 40 feet deep. But that's just where they pushed up land to keep the hurricanes from sweeping across. But I find it fascinating about the 2 different lakes, and because I always think sea has got salt water and so on, and it's really a lake.
Yeah.
And so my big question was, and you answered it, Lake Okeechobee, you can't see across it. It's like the ocean. This you said you could see across it.
Yeah, easily. And in fact, if you look at the pictures, almost all of the pictures that I take from the shore, you can see the other side of the lake, because it's just so small. So when you think of sea, don't think of sea, think of lake, and a relatively small one at that. Here's on the other side where I showed you the first picture, and I said it was Ramat, and this is the Golan Heights. This is where we stayed, and it was a beautiful place. If you go there, I highly recommend staying here. The food was excellent, but the views were they were beautiful. Now this is actually, I'm up in the restaurant area, and I'm pointing towards that city, And that's the city of Magdala. That's where Mary Magdalene was from. Okay, and I will take you there maybe next week, because that's also a place where it's really cool, but it's also one of those places where Jesus taught. This picture turns a little bit, and this is towards Capernaum, where closer to where the this is here. And the next picture, I want you to notice the UFOs coming in for a landing there at its home base of Capernaum. No, I'm joking. That's actually the lights from the restaurant that were shining in the glass where I was. But, I mean, they could be, you know. Yeah, those Franciscans, we don't know about them. This is actually looking at that town of Tiberias, the city of Tiberias that I was telling you about. It was beautiful. The reason I was taking this picture, though, is I was hoping for a flash. It was late into the night, and we heard what I thought was some rocket fire. And, of course, like I said, we're on the Golan Heights, so if there's going to be rocket fire, it's going to be relatively close to us. So I heard what I thought was rocket fire, and so I was taking pictures of Tiberias across the lake, and I didn't end up getting to see any, which is probably a good thing, but I did hear helicopters afterwards, so I'd say they probably got them. They're pretty good at it. We took a boat ride on the only Christian boat service in the Sea of Galilee, and it was called, the boat was called Faith. And that's actually why I wore this shirt today, because you can see it says Sailing on Faith, and on the backside, you can kind of see. But anyways, my dad bought me that shirt, and my wife shrunk it immediately after getting it home, so it doesn't fit me very well anymore. But he was fantastic, and at some point before service, I'm going to play you some of his CD, because he does worship music while you're on the boat, and it's just a beautiful worship service. And boy, I tell you what, half of it he sings in Hebrew, the other half in English, and it's very meaningful. On this day, it was a gusty day, but we would call it very mild, okay? You can kind of see the flags flying there, but it was relatively mild for us. But our boat captain, even with that mild 5-10 mile an hour winds, he didn't go out to the deep water because it was so dangerous. A storm could kick up. Notice when I show you some of these other pictures, you can see the shoreline just a few feet away, because what he did is he went up and then side and then turned right around and came back that way because he was too scared with just 5 and 10 mile an hour winds. It could be that dangerous. So, anyways, and there you kind of see the shoreline right back there. There's a little misty rain. Now, I promise we were having a much better time than what John looks like we were having here. He was not very happy in that picture, and I don't know why, but we were having a good time. This is Brother Mike. He's the one from my dad's church that came. He had a little water in his eyes, and if I'm honest, there were more than a few people that had water in their eyes during that worship service. But our excuse is it was raining. But that wasn't the reason. This shows you kind of the hillside, how steep and rugged it is. And this is the Golan Heights, okay? But this is also Gadara specifically. And so when you think of the Gadarene demoniac and those pigs that went over the edge, imagine them falling off those cliffs. That would have been a total loss. That would have been the first food flight recorded in the Bible. I thought that was good instead of food fight. Here's some more pictures of the area of Gadara and those cliffs. And like I said, if you hear of rockets and you hear the Golan Heights, just picture that. By the way, this is another failed attempt at panoramic shot. The boat is not bent on a 90-degree angle in the middle of it. That's just me as a failure as a photographer. So here's some more pictures as you go down the coast. And again, this is 5 to 10 mile an hour, but look at how the waves are picking up there. And there wasn't hardly any breeze at all. But it was very, as it comes over those hills, it really does a number. This is on the south edge of the Sea of Galilee. This is the headwaters of the River Jordan. And it goes all the way down, of course, down to Jericho and all of that. down to the Dead Sea. So, very quickly, I've taken you completely around the Sea of Galilee in pictures, and I've told you some of the things that are found in Capernaum. But it doesn't do it justice if I don't give you some of the passages that actually we read about. And I also want to leave us with a warning. The area around Capernaum was where Jesus chose his disciples, like Peter and Andrew, James and John, and also Matthew the tax collector. Many of the things that we read about in our scriptures, if you do a close enough study, you find out it happened within that small little acreage called Capernaum. Here's some of the other important events. Well, of course, Jesus lived there, Matthew chapter 4, verse 13. Mark chapter 2, he reported that it was his home. Matthew chapter 9 refers to it as his own city. And then, if that wasn't telling enough, John chapter 6, they couldn't find Jesus, so they went to Capernaum to find him because that's just where they expected him to be. Matthew chapter 4, verse 13. And leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt in Capernaum, which is by the sea in the regions of Zebulun and Naphtali, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, by the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light, and upon those who sat in the region in the shadow of death, a light has dawned. I want you to remember that prophecy there for a moment, because there was a lot of light that was shed on this city and the surrounding cities. Now it happened, Mark chapter 2, verse 15, as he was dining at Levi's house, that many tax collectors and sinners also sat with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many, and they followed him. This is where Jesus healed the paralytic, and Mark chapter 2, verse 4, and they broke open literally the ceramic tiles is what the original says of the house, and lowered him down, and it was because of the faith of his friends that he was forgiven. The nobleman's son, that was what it was healed from afar, John chapter 4, verse 46, where he turned water into wine, and then this man came. Jesus taught in the synagogue, like I mentioned earlier, John chapter 6, Mark chapter 1. This is where he called the disciples, Matthew chapter 4. This is where he called Matthew, found him, Matthew chapter 9. Healed the centurion's servant, Luke chapter 7. Jesus cast out the unclean spirit in the synagogue, Mark chapter 1. Raised Jairus' daughter and healed the woman with the issue of blood, Mark chapter 5. Healed Peter's mother-in-law, Mark chapter 1. It said that in the place of darkness a great light has shined. But here's the problem with a great light shining in the darkness. With the light comes great responsibility. Matthew chapter 11, verse 21, Jesus said, woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works which were done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I say to you, it will be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon in the day of judgment than you. By the way, that is all that is left of the city of Chorazin. That's it. A few walls, a few homes, nobody lives there, bunch of rocks. And you, Capernaum, who are exalted to heaven, will be brought down to Hades. For if the mighty works which were done in you had been done in Sodom. Now think about that. The other cities, he said, Tyre and Sidon, that is Gentiles. That's a big enough slap in the face. But with Capernaum, he said, if I'd have done the same thing in Sodom, it would have remained until this day. Yet I say to you that it shall be more tolerable for the land of Sodom in the day of judgment than you. Ouch. The city of Capernaum represents many who've been exposed to the gospel, and they may enjoy going to church. They may consider themselves Christians by association, but their familiarity with Jesus' word and their false sense of salvation is only going to be a curse to them. Because if you take light and you don't walk in the light, that light is judgment to you. He will say in Matthew chapter 7, verse 21, "Away from me, you evildoers, I never knew you." The people of Capernaum, they heard and saw what Jesus did and said, and yet they refused to believe. John chapter 1, verse 12, John chapter 12, verse 42. Why would they not believe? What would have cost them to believe? How would it have been so hard? What would they have had to give up? I mean, let's face it, their lives would have drastically changed following Jesus, but it would have been too high a cost compared to what they receive now. But we ask ourselves the same question, don't we? Because every single one of us sitting in here have been blessed more than most of the rest of the world combined. And what have we done with it? What have we done with it? Have we been filled with the Spirit? Is God using us? Is God moving through us? Are we walking in faith because we've seen Him do works and we're praying in it now? Or are we just going through our humdrum lives, just enjoying the familiarity of Jesus, but not the fellowship? What a dangerous, dangerous place to be. Dad, I tell you what, that passage scares me more than anything else in the Bible. That He says when they get on the day of judgment, He says, "Depart from me, I never knew you." That's scary. Because He goes down a list of all kinds of things that I've never even done in my life. And they were saying, "Hey, we've done these things, aren't we following you?" And He says, "I'm looking at all of those great things and I don't even know who you are. Depart from me, evildoers." A scary place to be. If God did not spare Capernaum due to their lack of faith, He will not spare those today who have heard the message, seen the evidence, and reject His Son. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 10, and Hebrews chapter 6, verses 4 through 6. Lord, help us to walk in the light that He's given us and to never turn around. Let's pray. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. It really does mean the world to me that you're getting a blessing out of it. If this video was a blessing, make sure to hit that thumbs up button for me. That way other people can find it as well. Here in the link section, you'll find playlists and new videos that we put out. We try to do 2 or 3 a week. You can also subscribe to the channel by pressing on my face and then hitting the bell icon, and that will alert you to new videos. May God richly bless you.